Now that we've gone through section 1 and learned about how to create and use graph databases, we're going to walk in section 2 and do more of a concrete example of using them in the real world. And the way that we're going to do this, we're going to start with an analysis primer. And what the primer is for is before you ever go to write any code, you should figure out how you're going to approach the problem and the way in which you're going to solve it. So we're just going to walk through the problem that we're going to solve, graphing your email, and talk through how we're going to solve it in the subsequent sections. Then in the second piece of email parser, we're going to go through the idea of how you can connect to your email and extract the relevant information to download it so that you can create a graph. And then in the last part about email communication graphing, we're going to walk through using the Gephi tool to actually look at the graph and do some analysis. Now we're going to go through and do a bit of an analysis primer in terms of understanding how graph analysis can be used in the real world to solve real problems. And the way that we're going to cover this is I'm going to walk through the role again of social network analysis, how this can be applied to email, and then I'm going to talk about some examples of how to graph networks in the wild, and then I'm going to move forward over the next several videos and talk about how we're going to construct those videos in order to do a larger scale graph analysis demo. Now, one example of a network analysis problem is in an environment you have a lot of different people and you don't necessarily know all those other people. Well, you want to look across that group and say, how do I observe the interactions between these people in order to figure out who they are and how they communicate? Most organizational structures have some level of hierarchy. So can we just look at an environment, monitor the flow of communication, and pick out those hierarchies? Similarly, we want to know who has the ability to influence others. If we want something to spread and we want to know how to get a message across, the easiest thing that we can do in an environment is to target those influencers that can then extend out and reach other people. And then, if you want to reach a very specific individual and get some communicated message to that person, what's the appropriate path? So how can you identify a communication flow from one person to another if you have to get a very specific message across? Now, when you go to discover networks or do social network analysis, the best location to do it is from some level of vantage point where you have a lot of different feeds. In the example that we're going to use for this course, we're going to focus specifically on one feed that we control, which is email. But if you want to do this discovering of networks at a larger scale or on something probably more meaningful across a larger environment, the more data feeds that you have and the more information you can watch, generally the better your picture is going to be. Now, when we go to gather and graph this information, we're going to notice some commonalities. In your email, you probably talk with people that are important to you. So if you have an outgoing edge or if someone sends a message to you, it generally means that you're important to that person. Now, of course, we're important to a lot of mailing lists as well because they send me a lot of messages and probably you as well, but you don't actually reply to those newsletters. So you generally don't reply to the thing that comes to your inbox and says, save on this coupon or check out our newsletter. So what you'll have there is that will be one directional flow indicating that it's probably not that important to you. Now, another thing that you can do specifically is to discover hierarchy. So let's look at an example of how a hierarchy might work in a common development organization. You could have the CEO who sets an agenda and says, here's what we want to accomplish going forward in the next 6 months or over the year. The CEO will probably have the majority of his meetings with the VP of engineering, who will speak with her development managers in order to communicate the path of how they want to execute that. Those development managers will likely communicate very frequently with the VP of engineering and with each other, as well as the developers. But there's probably less communication back up to that CEO level, and maybe there is, but what we're going to find, generally speaking, is that communication tends to flow, and edges represent a bit of proximity. You're more likely to talk with the people that are in your group at your peer level, so those arrows that appear all the way on the right will be thicker, indicating a higher edge weight amongst people that you talk to on a regular basis. Now, when you look at your email, the way that email is typically represented is in a table format. From whom, what's the subject, to whom, what's the date, is it read or not? And you can represent one person's email in a table very easily. Or if you have multiple accounts, you can do that easily as well using a color coding or another column. But what happens when you get a lot of people's emails together? And what you find is that a lot of people's emails together is more of a form of a graph, where incoming edge weight reveals popular recipients of people who are emailed frequently, and those tightness of mutual edges means people who communicate back and forth to each other on a regular basis. So although it can be represented as a table, a graph will reveal information in different ways. Now, if you want to do some advanced research on email graphs, there's a good paper by Sydney University talking about the role of email analysis in terms of discovery of networks, picking out of communication structure within an organization, and how to discover shared interests between people in order to analyze the flow of information, such as computer viruses. You could also look at the spread of jokes or just the spread of really any type of thing that gets communicated. Now, the way that we're going to structure the next couple videos is in the next video, we're going to focus on parsing your email, going into your email and getting the information out in terms of from who to whom, who is on the CC, and in the graph, we're going to create a vertex per person. Then, when we have that person, we're going to create an edge per email or update the weight, indicating to whom the email was sent, as well as who the CC group was. And if you want to extend a little bit beyond the exercise, feel free to ask other friends in your network or people that you communicate with on a regular basis to run this as well and detect it in their environment. Now, what we'll expect to see at the end of all these videos is this is an example of how my 90 days of my email looked. What we see here, I only focus on the inbox or incoming, and what we can see is that those thick edges means group or people who email me a lot. One of them tends to be a newsletter. Now, and that's the thickness. So there's also the role you'll notice is color coded, and there's a green group, a blue group, and an orange group. And what email analysis and graph analysis was able to detect is those are specific networks of people that I know. In this case, two of them are different sides of the family, and one of them is a group of friends. So what we can see is that those groups tend not to actually talk to each other on a regular basis because I know different people in them for different reasons.